Thank you for being here as we hear from three artists who have strong links to the complex heritage of textiles. And are navigating their approaches to that lineage while creating contemporary works. The first artist that I'll be introducing is Francisco Bautista. Francisco is a fourth-generation master weaver in his family. He and his wife, Laura, were born in a Zapotec village in Oaxaca, Mexico. They've always been fascinated by the infinite possibilities of crossing threads. They use only hand-spun, hand-dyed wool and weave each of the works on a foot-pedal loom. The vibrant colors that you'll see in their weavings come from using natural dyes and aniline dyes. Together, they work to ensure that the quality achieved by the master weavers of old will continue to live on in each piece that they weave. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Francisco.
Good morning. To be honest with you, this is my first presentation. I'm a little bit nervous, but I will do my best. As Krista said, my wife and I, we were born in Oaxaca, Mexico. And we moved here in Oregon back in 2003, March 12, 2003 to be exact. And when we got here, it was raining. And then after the first week, I saw snow. It was so amazing. I was so happy. I called my family. I called my dad, my grandpa, and told them, I'm seeing snow here. Snow. I was outside all day, just admiring all the trees, covered in the snow. I was so happy. So let me start talking a little bit about my family. On this first slide, this is my family down in Oaxaca. I'm the one in the red pants, and this is in 1988. A customer of my dad took this picture, and I was so happy that day because that was one of our first pictures as a family. We didn't have any cameras to take memories, but I was so happy when my dad found this picture and shared it with me, and I shared it with my kids now, and they're so happy to see me. How I was when I was a kid, and I told him I'm the one with the red pants, and my son he just laughed with me and say, "Wow, Daddy, why red pants?" And I said, I don't know. So this is my family back in, like I said, 1988 in Teotitlán del Valle, Oaxaca, Mexico. And that's the type of loom that we use in our hometown to weave all our pieces. It's called a foot pedal loom. And this kind of looms, they were introduced in our hometown in the 1500s. My ancestors, they used to weave in a backstrap loom. And the woman was the weaver. And they wove only with cotton. But after the conquest, Spain, the people from Spain came and introduced sheep. With sheep, we have wool now, and they introduced this kind of loom. So to keep the tradition here in Oregon, as you saw the first picture, that's a family picture. But now I want to share this tradition with the next generation, the fifth generation, my kids. And I told them we must take a picture like my dad took, But I told my son, you don't need to wear red pants now. So this is my family here in Oregon. That's myself, my wife Laura, my daughter Cynthia, and my son David. And we used to have a husky, Kai, on that picture, but that's a different story now. And so after we moved here, my wife and I, we were so passionate to keep the tradition alive. We want to keep it for only one reason. We see in a lot of civilizations, the new kids, they don't have the interest to keep their tradition. Everything now it's technology, and they want to do an engineer or medical things. But that's okay. But for my wife and I, it's very important to share this weaving tradition with them. And we told them, you need to learn about our culture, you need to learn about our civilization, our family tradition, and they're in love with it. My daughter, she really likes to draw and design things. My son, last August, he had his first gallery show at in a gallery in Hood River, Columbia Center of the Arts. He wove 30 small pieces, but he was so excited to weave them. Especially with the last piece that he wove a traditional motif. It's called the Eye of God. And he was so excited to weave it, and he said, you know, Dad, when I grow up, I want to be the 5th generation, and I will weave Bauhaus. I said, okay, Bauhaus, okay. And the reason Bauhaus is, I want to tell a little bit about how we end up doing or inspired about Bauhaus. A couple years ago, when we started to do our spring sale at the convention center, Gathering of the Guilds, we're members with the Portland Hand Weavers Guild, and my wife and I, we always been fascinated to create our own designs. Change our motif, change our inspiration. And my first piece that I wove, I was telling my wife, well, let's create something like square, triangles, and see what we're going to do. And we created a beautiful piece, my first piece. And a woodworker there at the Gathering of the Guilds came to my booth and said, are you start doing Bauhaus? And I told him, what's Bauhaus? And he said, I'll be back. Let me grab a book for you. So he went to his booth, grabbed a book about Bauhaus, Annie Albers. And I would start reading, and the first thing that I did is saw the picture on the front page. I say, wow, I can do this with these colors. So my imagination just went, tried to say, oh, I can do this, but using my technique. So, and then I started searching online and read about Annie Albers and and her husband Joseph, and actually we're celebrating 100 years of the Bauhaus now. I think it's April 12th, 1919, from 1923. So it's been amazing how these motifs and how this new modern design started back then in Germany. So for me and my wife, it was so interesting to do this combination, to mix my weaving tradition with the Bauhaus tradition and create new motifs. So we start playing with my natural dyes and my aniline dyes, and we create beautiful pieces. This piece that you see on the screen won the Best of Show at the WeGo show here in Oregon, Weaver Guilds of Oregon. That's the name of the show. And I was so amazed when I heard that my piece won the Best of Show. I was so happy. I called my family down in Mexico, and they're so proud and say, wow, congratulations. And my kids, they're so proud of our family here. My daughter told me today, you are doing your best here, Daddy, to teach us to keep this tradition alive and create new things, inspiring in the Bauhaus, inspiring in our, weaving tradition. Because we are trying to do Bauhaus, but at the same time, it's the same technique that it's been used for centuries. But the only thing now I'm trying to be inspired more into these new motifs. And here in Oregon, a lot of We have a lot of customers, and one of them saw my recent weavings, and he told me, these pieces that you are working now, they're amazing. You are doing an excellent job trying to combine this Bauhaus tradition with your weaving tradition. And this is one of the pieces that this customer bought from our family here. It's one of my Bauhaus. And when we start doing Bauhaus, another thing that I really like to share with you all is we started to sign our weavings. I don't know if you can see or from down there, they have 4 dots. Those 4 dots represent 4 generations in the family, but also represents the family members here in Oregon. Represents myself, my wife, my daughter, and my son. The first piece that I wove, it was squares. But my wife and I, we were talking, how we can sign our weavings. And we were talking and discussing, and we ended up doing dots for only one reason. In our traditional weaving, dots, they have a sacred meaning. They represent the seed of life. So each dot in our signature represent the seed of life. Each generation, each seed of life. As a family member, we are a seed of life. So, and on this Bauhaus design too, we are trying to play with, to mix some of my traditional motifs too. As you can see at the bottom too, we have a traditional motif. It's called the Eye of God. It's a very, you'll see these symbols in a lot of civilizations around the world. You see Navajo weavings, Turkish, Pakistan, Kilim rugs, or Central America, South America, and represents the Eye of God. So this is what we're trying to do now. We're trying to create different things inspired into Bauhaus and inspired at the same time with my weaving tradition, with the Zapotec tradition in my family. So it's been so great. The journey here, it's been amazing. My kids, they're enjoying weaving, especially my son. I think last July, when I did my at the show at the Salem Art Fair, and a lady came in my booth and he said, "Are you Francisco?" I said, "Yes." And I told her, "Have you met before?" She said, "No." And she told me, "I used to teach at the elementary school in Sandy. And I had a student, his name was David. And we asked everybody, what you would like to do when you grow up?" Everybody was saying an engineer, a doctor, or anything. But when David answered, he said, "I want to be the 5th generation in my family as a weaver, a master weaver," she said. And thank you. So it was, and hear that for me was, I didn't have words to describe how happy I was because, and I talked to my wife and say, "Wow, did you hear what she said?" "Yeah," she said, "Yeah, I can hear that." So I had those words here, and I was almost crying in front of her, but I was, trying to hold it, and I told her, I don't want to cry in front of her, But it's something that I don't know. It's really hard to describe it. How I feel about my family here, how I feel about my culture, especially being too far from my hometown, and. But I love being here. Oregon, it's my home now. Oregon means a lot to me. The people, I'm used to the weather now, the rain, which I really like it, especially fall time. Full time, I really like how things are here, and Oregon, it's opening the doors for me and for my family, and I'm very thankful to be here. Thank you so much.
She is an artist, a writer, and an instructor at the Department of Art at the University of Oregon in Eugene. Her work critically explores the cultural, economic, historic, and metaphoric aspects of how textiles and textile processes live within and reflect the values of human societies, from an acknowledged standpoint of her white settler identity. Sonia has made her work exhibited and published nationally and internationally, including 2 years of research in Indonesia as a Fulbright Fellow. I am pleased to introduce Sonia Dahl.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you, Francisco, for that beautiful storytelling presentation. I really appreciated it. Let me just make sure that this is the right place in front of my face. Does that sound okay? Everybody can hear me okay? Great. So I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of respect that Portland metro area, and therefore the site we currently occupy, rests upon the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, the Calumet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. I live and work in Eugene, which is the traditional homeland of the Kalapuya people. It's become increasingly important to me to make these kinds of acknowledgements because I occupy an identity as a contemporary white settler of Oregon. And the history, as we all know, is very complex. And my work is situated in a way that I'm constantly thinking about and taking into consideration my status as a contemporary settler of Oregon. And so it's deeply important to me to pay my respects to the people who first lived here. So I'd like to begin my talk on kind of a related note by reading a quote by Winona Laduke from her book, Recovering the Sacred, which is a book about recovering from the settler colonial history in the US. She writes, "While some of the Europeans who settled North America came for religious refuge, others came in search of adventure, bent on discovering the exotic. In the process of leaving behind their histories in the old lands, the colonists became a people in search of a history, a desire that led many to collecting the history of other peoples." She goes on to write, "Perhaps it is in an effort to feed the immense spiritual void inherited from its colonial past that the mainstream culture has maintained a persistent tendency towards wanting to discover, classify, and collect everything the mainstream considers exotic. Descendants of settlers are, in a sense, haunted by the nostalgia for the lost cultures and fabled pride their forebears worked so hard to annihilate." So I'd like to just let that sink in for a minute. It's heavy, right? Particularly for those of us who are descended from and entangled in settler culture today still. But this is the complicated terrain in which I have situated my work over the last half decade or so, really challenging myself to ask some direct questions about the ways I engage with ideas, stories, histories, and material lineages of the textile processes that are central to my work. So I'd like to spend these next 15 minutes or so just sharing about 3 different bodies of work that I've been working on over the last few years that deal with specific material histories. And those are indigo dye, Pendleton woolen fabrics, and whitework embroidery. And I'll explore how working with these materials has really informed and expanded my critical understandings about how my work with stitch and dye is linked into and entangled with broader social realities and histories. So indigo dye is one of my greatest and longest material loves. I've been working with it for over 12 years. Indigo dye was in part what led me to pursue my Fulbright research in Indonesia 7 years ago. But the longer I've worked with and studied indigo's stories worldwide, the more I've come to understand that to love indigo is no innocent thing. In many cultures, indigo dye is considered a spiritually dangerous or unstable substance, associated with the perishability of both cloth and bodies. Indigo has been enjoying extreme trendiness over the last decade or so, sometimes verging on the fanatical. As one breathless blogger I read exclaimed, "Indigo is more than just a color. It's a mood, a style. This is a trend that's yours for the taking. What you make of it is up to you." So I find statements like this really uncomfortable, both in light of Winona Laduke's critical words that I read earlier, but also in light of indigo's role as a colonial boom crop in the American South and its all too cozy relationship with the transatlantic slave trade. So when I returned from my last trip to Indonesia in 2016, I was thinking very deeply about all the time I'd spent there and the ways that my status as a white foreigner had afforded me in many ways sort of an all-access pass to other people's material cultures. And that's not to discount, of course, the genuine friendships and incredible hospitality that I experienced everywhere I went there. But I was really sensitive to the power dynamics inherent in being a well-funded foreigner, traveling alone through many different situations. And I was increasingly aware of how odd it was to cast my eyes to other people's indigo cultures without first examining the one I was coming from in the US. So this work, titled Colonial Glory, grew out of that period of reorienting my focus and turning the lens of my research inward and deeper into American indigo culture during both the colonial period and the contemporary indigo boom we still find ourselves in today. In the 18th century, indigo and rice were often planted as companion crops to keep plantation owners' land and their enslaved labor forces productive year-round. This profitable arrangement contributed to the explosion in the importation of enslaved African people, as well as increased land grabbing by white plantation owners and settlers of native land in the Southeast. I feel that to work with indigo today as a descendant of European settlers is to be implicated in this story's continued unfolding. So I was thinking about the materials of rice and indigo. Rice, for much of the world's population, is the essence of sustenance. Blued rice, however, is a ruined food. Its ability to nourish the body is lost. In much the same way, the stories we share lack sustenance if they're edited into slivers of the whole truth. In both Colonial Glory and this piece that followed it, an etymology of red, white, and blue, I was making use of this commonly available star quilt motif, which is highly adaptable and bears sort of contradictory titles such as the Lone Star Quilt and Native American Star Quilt, among other titles. I think something that's so interesting about quilt motifs is that they change meanings over time and in different contexts. But there's this sort of semiotic play going on with the titles and the meanings behind quilts, and that's continued to be really important in my work. I was also thinking in these works about how the first versions of the American flag were hand-sewn patchwork. Minus the batting for warmth, these flags were essentially quilts, symbols of protection, safety, and a place called home. The blue field on these early flags, which played host to that increasing number of multiplying white stars, was dyed with American indigo blue. And so I think it's important to really think about that. Think about what's embedded in that material lineage of those particular objects. I used indigo dye, coarse salt, and the red dye stuff cochineal, which is the bodies of beetles that live on cacti. As metaphors, as sort of material metaphors in this work, for the cultural grief that's inherent to consuming stories that favor historical amnesia over remembering and responsibility. Since moving back to Oregon 2 years ago, I've been revisiting the stories and the mythos surrounding the settlement of the West. I found a fascinating book at the Lane County Historical Museum that documents scores of quilts that were made by Westering women of the pioneer era, coupled with stories about their families and their experiences on the Oregon Trail, and then their subsequent settlement of Oregon Territory. Many of the quilts made by these women contained motifs that metaphorically kind of explained or described their experiences of migration. Motifs like wild geese or birds in flight, which speak to migration and the move west, or motifs titled for the new terrain like the Delectable Mountains or pine tree motif, symbols of the search for rootedness in new soil. Again, interest in that sort of the storytelling capacity of these different quilt motifs and the ways that they can be interpreted. So in this ongoing body of work that I've been working on over the last year or so, titled Recounting Fragments, I've been using Pendleton woolen fabrics, those very iconic Oregonian material, very complicated history, to construct these fragmented patchwork quilt objects, using some of those semiotically charged pioneer-era quilt motifs. As a contemporary settler of Kalapuya lands myself, I recognize that the mythos of migration and settlement and discovery that infuses this region doesn't form a whole cloth necessarily, inclusive of all the stories and lived experiences that comprise this place. So these artworks grow out of a state of questioning and reckoning with what it means to settle in a place. What is left behind? What is claimed on arrival? What is displaced or elided in the making of a new life and a sense of home? So I'll take a quick look at some of the pieces included in this body of work. This piece titled A Settlement makes use of the pine tree motif that I mentioned earlier, which is a symbol of rootedness, of searching for rootedness in a new place. But the roots are always pointing outwards, away from each other. And I rendered this sort of quilt object out of coarse salt again in this temporary formation on the floor that can very easily be swept up at the end of the exhibition. So it doesn't take up space for long, it's temporary. This piece, Implicate Incomplete, uses the birds in flight or wild geese motif, but I gutted the quilt and left only the border, which creates a sort of framing device that's intended to metaphorically implicate the viewer and myself, the maker, in these stories and histories that I'm talking about. This one is made from jagged excerpts of a quilt motif called the Delectable Mountains. So the topic of the last project I'd like to share with you is white work, as both cloth and as cultural action. The word white work references forms of white-on-white embroidery and quilting that were popular in the 16th and 19th centuries throughout Europe, Scandinavia, and North America, all the places from which I claim ancestry. These white work techniques were considered often the epitome of a young needlewoman's skills. White work required patience, time, focus, precision, and a steady hand. Unsurprisingly, these pristinely stitched textiles were often employed to metaphorically uphold attributes of whiteness that reflected favorably upon the needlewomen themselves and the societies to which they belonged. So this piece is comprised of a sort of symbolic white flag of surrender, surrounded by 13 stars made of salt, representing those first 13 colonies that became the United States of America. And I was thinking at the time a great deal about salt. This was around the same time I had made the etymology of red, white, and blue, and I started thinking about salt as a material as well. I was thinking about salt as a preserving agent, and also the pillar of salt that Lot's wife in the Bible was turned into for looking back at her burning city and the life she was forced to leave behind. And it seemed to me that this story had a really intense relationship with the state of whiteness in culture today. There's a cultural shift underway these days in which the benefits of white identity are being both simultaneously contested and championed on the public stage. There are activist calls to both decenter whiteness and to expose the often hidden structures of its inner workings. Oregon is home to many active and notorious white supremacist organizations and militia. In the field of textiles, many artists and scholars of color are calling upon artists, white artists and scholars such as myself, to take responsibility for the ways we have appropriated, whitewashed, and professionally benefited from the material histories and cultures of others throughout the world. So there's all these things going on right now that are really complex and that I'm really listening to and taking to heart in my work. So with all of this in mind, I hand quilted this poetic inscription on the flag. They say she became salt, preserved, forever in a backwards glance. Perhaps she didn't realize she was doing it, holding so tightly to all she thought she knew. In all of these works that I've shared so far, I've been compelled to examine more carefully what is meant when we invoke the fabric of society as an organizing metaphor for shared civic culture. What is the structure of such a social cloth? Is it plain woven with equal balance between threads moving back and forth, up and down? Is it a stitched patchwork of many designs radiating outwards from a centralized motif? Is it like Penelope's weaving, perpetually a work of fiction, of creation and erasure doomed to a cycle of infinite repetition? Or is the fabric of society a story cloth, embroidered with all the tales of all the lived experiences that comprise its past and present, unfurling into the future? When we embroider our own stories, both personal and collective, are we considering the structure of the cloth that supports our stitches? Because the process of making white work demands that equal attention be paid to the underlying structure of the cloth as to the composition of the stitches that are applied to it, the stitcher becomes intimately involved in their relationship with both substance and technique. With a piece of finely woven linen stretched only inches from my face, usually about this close, I pass my needle back and forth in the tiny holes between warp and weft threads, tugging to open up space between them. White work involves readjusting the vision so that one can look at the very structure of the fabric's weave with great precision. Knowing how and with what a cloth is made allows the stitcher to analyze and plot their interventions. White work, in the way that I see it, is a process of opening up spaces in the cultural cloth, but it is also a process in which we must each acknowledge that all the prejudices, hidden assumptions, fears, desires we each carry all form a matrix of cloth that defines our lives, ourselves, and our individual experiences of the world. To engage in white work, it is necessary to pull back the warp and weft of our own cloth and open up spaces that release these things and allow for new growth and new awareness to penetrate. So it's quite possible that the personal and cultural processes of white work will indeed demand the highest level of skill as we who benefit from our whiteness take our needles and thread and responsibly re-enter the social fabric to which we are inextricably entangled. White work will, I hope, grow from such little accumulating acts of treason. The rise and fall of needle and thread, piercing cloth, rearranging the weave structure, one stitch at a time. Thank you.
All right. I would like to introduce Adrian Cruz, Harlem native. Adrian creates brilliantly colored fabric art, embellished in rhythmic improvisational arrangements of beauty. Her creative vision has garnered invitations to create public art in Portland, allowing her imagery to flow from textile creations to concrete fabrications. Adrian has exhibited internationally in Brazil, Costa Rica, and South Africa, and nationally at the Smithsonian, the Folk Art Museum in New York, the American Craft Museum in New York, the Museum of African Diaspora in San Francisco, the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, and the Fowler Museum of Cultural History in UCLA, just to name a few. She's included in collections in the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, Harborview Medical Center, Seattle, Portland Community College, Reed College, and numerous private collections. Please join me in welcoming Adrian Cruz.
I'm not sure where to begin. Take these off. I will say that I was aware of color at a very early age, thanks to my grandmother's little dog that had colorful dog biscuits. I remember particularly the orange, which is my favorite color, and the green, and I could not make a connection between why the biscuits tasted so bad when they looked so pretty. And then I'm speaking to color because that's where I wind up. Whenever I got a box of crayons, I always had to arrange the colors properly, so the orange was first. And then I was insulted if I got the box and the colors weren't right. The colors have to be lined up a certain way. My mom, who's sitting right over here, always knitted and crocheted and made clothing, and I would go with her to the yarn shops or fabric stores to choose yarns, and I didn't realize then it was color theory, you know, what happens if we put this color here and what happens there. And I was always surprised when we would get colors and then she'd bring them home and start stitching them together, and some of them I didn't like anymore, just because of where it was arranged. So color from the beginning, and I always wanted to be identified as an artist, and went to art school and high school and college, where I actually majored in sculpture. It just worked out that way. And it wasn't until I was in college with the sculpture, and I didn't have the teacher who I had in high school who was really guiding me, and I saw that everybody in the school seemed like they were doing whatever they wanted. And I thought, they're doing whatever they want. And then I had to ask myself, well, what do I want to do? So I ditched the sculpture for yarn because that's what was happening at home. And I began crocheting the sculptures, which thankfully I don't have any pictures of. Anyway, this slide here is from 1977 in my first apartment in my crochet corner. Things really started to open up for me with crochet. I liked it because it was forgiving. You could make a mistake and fix it easy, and I love the way I could make the colors change. Let me go. Which one? I gotta do this. I like the way colors changed with pattern. It's actually really hard for me to describe, but I did this for about 17 years, tapestry crochet. And after I had children, actually after my first daughter was born, I didn't realize how much was involved with the tapestry crochet until I couldn't do it anymore. Meaning that I could sit and crochet, and my daughter would take a thread and run across the room. And there it went, so much quicker than it took to put it together. And so the piece in the middle is actually the last crochet jacket that I made. I guess that was in 1985. And what used to take me a week to do then took 2 months, because it was just a whole different mentality. And so I just started doing crowns, small things that I could get done and not battle. And about 6 years went by, and I was not quite feeling like my full self. I wasn't really creating. Being a mom was good, but something was missing because I'm used to making things. And I took a class at the Oregon School of Arts and Crafts for quilting. And then designs that I had in crochet transferred to fabric, which was like night and day, because with crochet, I was actually creating the fabric. With quilting, the fabric's already there. I just have to cut it and piece it together. And it was a whole lot easier to be a mom quilter than a crocheter who became a mom, because the quilting then adapted to my environment as a mother, whereas the other way around, it was just couldn't quite figure it out. And this one is called Dancing the Coltrane. This is not my earliest quilt, but that's another story about why I don't have photos of my early quilts. Initially, I was, when I was quilting, since the whole fabric thing was happening, and I had started collecting fabrics, African fabrics, I guess in the late 70s, and I was really enthralled with kente cloth, and so I actually tried to crochet kente cloth. I tried quilting kente cloth, and then there was another style that I really, really was excited about from Nigeria, the Yoruba Egungun costumes, which I get a thrill from these. I get such a thrill. And so I was looking at these and trying to figure out how I could incorporate that idea into my work. And so these are my 2 attempts, many years apart, of, I should say that, what is it? The Egungun is for it's an ancestral dance. And Egungun is ancestor. And in the costumes, these are actually worn. Someone puts these on and they dance in it, and the fabric moves around. And I'm not Nigerian or Yoruba, so I couldn't tell you everything that's in there, but the fact that there was a spirit content with it really connected with me, because spirit is so much a part of what happens when I'm working, because I'm thinking, even when I crocheted, as I'm working, I may not necessarily know where this is coming from, but I know it's not me. It's coming from something way beyond, because how else would I know how to do this? It's, I'm receiving something here. The work that I do, I think partly because of the sculptural background, I I initially had a problem with quilting because it was so flat. And so I like to have some dimension in the work. And I also like for it to be a full sensory experience. So, I want you to touch it. I want you to smell it. I want you to see it. I want it to reflect. And it is a meditative process to create. So all of that is wrapped up in there. And then these two works, my friend Stacy put together. I was getting help putting these slides together, and she put these two together, and I thought it was pretty fascinating because one, the triangle goes up, and the other, the triangle goes down. But she put them together because of the reference. One is, the first one, Love Positive, was for the Baldwin family, James Baldwin's family, and the Warrior of Light Shield for Obama's self-explanatory of what's going on. They're both for representing family. And I made the first one for my mom's best friend after her mother passed. And this photo was from her homecoming program. And I wanted to gift her with the picture of her mom and her brother. And so I made this for her, and then she placed it on her chair in her home. And the Obama quilt, just before the inauguration, maybe about, it was November, right? November, I got the call before the inauguration, like, hey, there's a big thing going on. When have we had a black president? We have to do something. And so quilters were called from around the country to create a piece to honor Obama to be shown at the Historical Society in Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. This one is a really special one for me for many reasons. One is painted fabric. I had never painted on fabric before, and I was asked to be part of a calendar that was being produced called Art in Service of the Lord, and all of the art was to be biblical and representing black people. I don't know anything about the Bible except that it's a book. So it was a challenge in that sense, but when they said, well, we want you to do Deborah under the palm tree, and I was like, palm trees, I know, I could work from there. And so I started with the palm tree. I had printed fabric that already had faces on it, and I painted it green. And I'm thinking, well, if she's a prophet and wise, then she must have ancestors and spirits guiding her. There's something special about this tree. And the face, oh, right, and I did the hands really large to represent her strength. And the last thing really to be done was her face, because I wasn't sure how to do that. And I pulled up a photograph of my great-grandmother, my mother's grandmother, as reference. This looks absolutely nothing like her, but it was a reference for the image, and I chose to paint it because the calendar was all paintings, and mine was going to be the only fabric one. And actually, it was because of the way I was asked to do it that I did it, because I would have normally said, I don't do that kind of work. Thank you, but no thank you. But the person who invited me said, but Valerie said, he said, I really dig your work, but I know you don't do this kind of thing, and I didn't think this project was for you, but Valerie said you could do it. And I was like, well, if Valerie said I could do it, I'm going to do it. We were the only two women on the project. And this piece, I've had more requests to reproduce for all kinds of things, programs and stuff from around the world, mostly Israel, believe it or not. And then painting went on to another level when I was asked to, actually, no, this one I wasn't asked. I commissioned, no, it was a Percent for Art project that I applied for just to go through the process of applying because I had a friend who kept saying, oh, you need to branch out and do other things. And the Northeast Health Center, this Multnomah County building, is in the community that I live in. I thought, oh, well, I wouldn't mind throwing some color on that building. And I applied for it without thinking that I would get it. And so when I got the call that I got it, after I got up off the floor, I was like, now what do I do? Now what do I do? I mean, my proposal, I think, was 3 sentences, maybe. But I put this in to show the connection of how the crochet transferred, again, from, as well, I should say, not again, for quilting and then painting. I'm working in a grid all the time with crochet and coming up with these geometric patterns and designs, which also include Adinkra symbols, which are Ghanaian language and symbols that was originally used to identify kings, the life of kings. The Starbucks mural that was commissioned when they were the neighborhood I live in was being gentrified, and they didn't say it was Starbucks. I just got a notice saying that there was a client who was looking at portfolios for something that was going to be happening in the area. Okay, I've turned in my portfolio. It was about a year later before I even got a reply on it, and it turned out it was a Starbucks opening up. They didn't usually use murals or individual art. All their stuff is, the wallpaper is whatever it is, but it was an attempt to appease the community to like, hey, we're moving in, and hey, we got Adrian here, and she's painted on the wall, and this no longer exists because it's been painted over. This is the light rail station at Killingsworth and Interstate. And this time the crochet patterns have moved to concrete, steel, and glass tiles, which you can't really see too well in this. But I came to a point with my work where I went through a long period where I thought, gee, every time I make something, everything looks the same. I keep repeating the same thing, and I felt like I should be more innovative. And then I had to make peace with, this is who you are, and this is what you do, and this is where it comes from. But it took a long time for me to get there. It's my automatic. So the bench over there has the same pointed triangular legs that is in the centerpiece, which is, I call that the stone quilt that's embedded in the platform there on the station. And you can't really see them too well, but they're little terrains at the top of the roof of the station there that's triangular and painted. I went through these really fast, didn't I? This is my last slide. And that's the image of my great-grandmother, the one whose face I used for the Deborah piece. And you can see they don't look alike, but it's a reference. And I put this one in because this is the most recent thing I've worked on. It's on my work table. My cousin, I come from a very small family. My grandparents came here from Jamaica, and our branch of the family, I'm one of only 10 grandchildren. I know in some families there are 10 children. There's only 10 grandchildren, and now it's only 9 of us. And one of my cousins was concerned that his grandchildren had no sense of who their family was. And so he asked if I would create a memento pouch for his daughter to present to her sons that helped them see who they were and who their family was. And so I said, okay, I could do that. I didn't know until I sat down that I was going to use my great-grandmother's image, because I'm sitting there and thinking, well, how am I going to do, how do I represent us? So I printed out her face on fabric and built up. And this is only about, it's a really small piece. And he gave me these little black coral pieces that he had bought in Jamaica on his trip there, I guess back in the 80s. And the little there's a little pocket under her face that's open that he's going to insert the first clipping of hair of his daughter and the last clipping of hair of his mother, who's my mom's oldest sister. And it will be stitched together and bring it home of our family through textiles. Well, a big piece I left out. I come from a textile family. I kind of came in the back door with fabric because it was so intimidating to see my mom and her sisters examine a garment when they looked at it. They could pick up a thing and it could look beautiful, but it didn't get the beautiful stamp until they'd looked at every seam, is it a bound buttonhole? Is it, all these little details, and if it didn't meet that, then it wasn't beautiful. That was so intimidating to me. The last thing I wanted to do was sew. So, and then 2 of my mother's aunts used to make bridal gowns for, what fancy store was that, Mom? I don't remember. I think it was not Lord and Taylor or Bonwood Teller. And of course they were in the back room, so you never saw them, but there were 2 Jamaican women back there making those dresses. So bringing it home means I went through the circle of sculpture to bring myself home to crochet and colors, my first love, and sharing it with my family and who we are. Thank you.
So we're going to move up to the Diaz and then have questions from the audience and a few questions that I have to ask as well. Thanks. So I'd like to ask a question about the choices in materials. I know that you use different dyes, whether it's natural or aniline, and at what point you make those decisions, and then also for both of you, when material decisions come into play.
Okay. Every time that we decide to create a motif, we always been using sheep wool. It's called churro because to me it's the best to hold the natural dyes and at the same time the aniline dyes. When a lot of our pieces they are washable. I know sometimes some customers they're really afraid why put a wash wool because we pre-shrunk the wool before weave these pieces. So to me the wool is very easy to work with and for only those two reasons, because holds the dyes really well, and it's very durable.
Well, I've worked with a lot of different materials. I'll start with indigo, like I did in my presentation. And I started to work with indigo. I honestly don't remember the reason. I just had this sudden need. I need to figure out how to work with this. I think I loved the color and realized, somewhere along the line that it came from a dye that was from a plant that was then fermented and all these different things. And the more I started to learn about it, the more fascinated I was. And so for me, working with indigo was this sort of intuitive need. And so I took a class at a community college for natural dyes, and it was, love at first dip, which I know is the case for a lot of people who work with indigo. It's a really seductive and magical substance to work with. So, I started working with indigo out of love, which I think is really wonderful, and what's happened over time, the more I sort of learn about indigo's history, and the more I sort of realize, gosh, this is really complicated terrain to be navigating with this material, and going all the way across the world to kind of study about it, and all those questions that I brought up in my presentation. What's happened over time, I think, is that I've started to come to materials kind of based on ideas or things that I was trying to work through. So in a lot of ways, that's why I'm working with the Pendleton fabrics, because I'm thinking about, coming back to Oregon. I'm thinking about the stories and histories here. And the white work embroidery it's like it's in the word white work. I've been working with various activist organizations for a while and around racial justice, and so thinking about what materials can I work with to think about those, to think through those things. Sometimes I find the materials that I need because I'm already kind of thinking in that direction, but then the materials have so much to teach me. So that was a long answer to a short question. Thanks.
And I'm going to ask again, what was the question? Oh. I'm a collector, and I absolutely love color, and I love tactile things. So color is the first draw. These days is less about the fabric because I could get that. What I love now is once the piece is completed, the embellishment, the putting on the sequins, putting on the beads, beetle wings I found, which look like sequined nails or something. They're really, really fascinating. I really like to feel it on a spiritual level. I like for it to feel ancient. I like for it to feel tribal. So I look for materials, or I collect materials. I just got to look on my tables. I have so much stuff. I collect materials that give me those feelings, and I actually should be dyeing my colors because I'm so particular about it, but I also have super sensitive skin and actually lose my skin if I put my hands in the wrong substance. Ask me how I know. So I look for fabric sometimes from other cultures. I love African tie-dye and, just anything that looks good and looks like is real and it has a history with it. And then I could piece that together however I want, but it's the embellishment pieces that I really get excited about.
And I was also curious about titling the work. And some of that process, if there's a theme in mind, of course, as you're starting, but when the titling comes into play, are you working towards that, or is that something that you find after the piece is already in the world?
You talk about name your piece. Okay, in my case, I don't know if you remember my third slide, the piece that won the Best of Show. The name of that piece is called Mis Sentimientos, or my feelings, my sentiments. And they asked me why. I started to weave that piece in 2017, July 2017, at the Salem Art Fair. And I didn't have any idea how, or a piece in mind before. I just started to weave it. And as I start weaving this piece, everything that I feel, everything that my hand, my brain, and my heart feels at that moment, we wove it into this piece. So each piece, it's very personal because represents like the motif says my feelings, and it also represents everything that my ancestors taught me over the years. So that's how we name our pieces. It depends on what we feel at that moment, what we have in mind, and because I believe it's when we weave, in my case, we have three elements that work together: my mind, my heart, and my hands. Those three work together and create. So after we create, and everything that we feel, it's into the weaving.
I don't even feel like I need to say anything now. It's beautiful. So I think titling work can be hard. Sometimes it comes just intuitively. Sometimes I've found some source image or piece of language that caught my attention. Sometimes the materials or the techniques tell me what, it's like the language follows the process. So it varies a lot. The piece that I showed with the blue dyed rice, Colonial Glory, I got that title from, I was searching around, I think I was doing a Google search, like patriotic quilt motifs. I just had this idea, I was kind of working through it. And I found this downloadable quilt pattern titled Colonial Glory that was sort of this this glorification of that first flag with the 13 stars of the 13 colonies with like one little heart in it. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's a lot to think about right there. And so that was the source for that particular title, was kind of drawn from that thing that I found on online when I was searching for different quilt patterns. But yeah, it happens a lot of different ways. Yeah.
That's a very good question. The pieces pretty much name themselves. I never start out with a name first. A lot of times when I start to make something, I have absolutely no idea what's going to come out. And there have been times where I thought I had a working title, and the working title gets me through the piece, but at some point it says, no, and whatever it is. There's the one I had called Love Supreme that was up there. That one came about from a drive along the Columbia Gorge. I was driving to my friend's house in Yakima, and it was the first time. I'm a New Yorker, so I'm a subway girl. So driving is a big deal, and this was a big deal for me to drive solo from Portland to Yakima. So I'm feeling good. I'm driving along the gorge, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful. I have the music playing, and I'm turning along a bend. And just as I'm turning along the bend, John Coltrane's piece, "A Love Supreme," came on, and the intro was perfect for the view. And it just stuck in my head. And some years later, that quilt was actually for a exhibit relating quilts to jazz. So when I heard that, I thought, oh, I know what I'm going to do. So that piece, of course, does not look like a drive along the Columbia Gorge, but that's what it felt like. The other small piece that I think was Love Positive, that got its name because Mrs. Baldwin's whole energy was about love. That's what she promoted. That's what she instilled in her children. And in the piece, there's a poem by our friend Valerie that's called Positive. She just repeats positive. Be positive, live positive, act positive, positive, positive. So that it became Love Positive. But they all named themselves, and I don't know who these babies are until they tell me.
All right. Well, I would like to open up to questions from the audience. Right back there.
Yeah, I have one question for Sonia and then one question for both Francisco and Adrian. So Sonia, the lens that you applied to the complicated history of indigo, I'm wondering how you apply that same lens to using materials like cotton and the histories of cotton in the States. And Francisco and Adrian, I really loved hearing you talk about ancestral knowledge. And Adrian, when you mentioned, like, you just know, you don't know how you know, but you just know when you're doing something and putting something together. So I'd love to hear more about that feeling, that moment, that just the whatever, like, what is it for you? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. You bring up a really important point that once you start to see one material through its entire history and all the complications, it's hard to unsee that in anything else. So absolutely, working with cotton is complicated on a similar level to working with indigo. It's somehow trickier for me because cotton is so a part of everything. You know, cotton is in almost all the clothing I wear. It moves through the world. It really is like one of these, you know, these materials that it relates to the same sort of slavery histories and plantation histories and those kind of tricky and hard emotional periods in American history that continue to have reverberations today. But it's also, it has really complicated relationships to international trade today, to ecological issues. So I have to admit, I don't entirely know how to deal with cotton specifically, because it's hard to be a textile artist and not work with cotton in some way or another. You know, I can be very intentional about how I work with indigo. I can be very intentional about how, you know, I work with the linen and these embroideries. But cotton is in almost everything. So it's not a material that I've sort of delved into in the same way I have indigo, but it's absolutely related, and I think a really important thing to bring up. You know, any number of substances, you know, I could be applying the same sort of lends to sugar and different spices and, so many different things that kind of traveled the roots of the world during that sort of imperialist period and continue to, just in different guises. So, yeah, thank you for that question.
Ancestors. Okay. That's a really good question. I'll start by saying the besides loving colors, the real reason why it became a creative person, it was as a healing process. I needed to do something, enjoy something that made me feel good, and creating always did that for me. Over time, it would show me more things, because when you're making things, it's a meditation of sorts. The stillness and things come up in meditation. Over time, as I would look for things through looking at cultural, looking at fabrics or textile designs, looking for connections, like, I feel, this is what I see, and this is, that sort of thing would happen, and I would start to feel connected, have like a really solid connection, not just a feeling. When I'm working and I know that it's right is when I'm working on the piece and I'm always following instructions. I never start out, I'm going to do this is going to go. I may know the size and have an idea of what fabrics I might want to use. A lot of times I said, we're not going in there. You got to do something else. But once it gets going, once the pot is boiling and it's really cooking and there's a flow that's going, and I think, I think I need whatever, it'll be right there on my table, or it'll be really nearby, and it's confirmation that I'm doing the right thing. And the channel is there. The other thing is when I'm really working, whatever I'm supposed to do comes to me that morning. When it actually gets me out of the bed. It's like 4:30, this is what you're going to do now. Get up, do this. And then I work on that until they're like, okay, we're off for today. And then if I try to push it, whatever I thought I was doing, I have to take out the next day. It's not right. I have to follow it. And if I try to insert myself in there, it just doesn't work. And then there was this one time, this is one of my favorite stories because it was fascinating and it's true. I was in one of these moments in my workspace and getting high on what was developing. And I got up from my work table to go get an embellishment, and off to the side there was 3 little people, like 3 little ancestors, I call them. They were like in a huddle, and it felt like they were, what's the word? Not channeling, but if you're sending messages and I'm receiving the message, that's what was happening. I did a double take. Of course, when I looked again, nobody was there, but I saw them. I saw them, and I smiled from the inside out, and I just felt really good.
Thank you for the question. Every time that I'm on the loom, my ancestors talk to me, because every time I'm crossing the threads or creating or inspiring to a new motif, they're talking to me, because weaving tradition, it's been in my village for centuries. And as a kid, I remember when my dad or my grandpa, they started me teaching how to weave. And we are 3 brothers. I'm the oldest in the family, and as the oldest in the family, you must teach your other brothers, who, like in my civilization, teach them the right things or be an example to them. So when my dad taught me how to do, or the first thing that we need to learn as a weaver was making fringes. So I was in charge of my 2 brothers, telling them, hey, we need to do fringes, because my dad and my mom, they left, and they say, you must do the fringes, and when we get home, you must do all this. So that kind of story that reminds me, like I said, every time that I'm doing something, even now here in Oregon, when I started to teach my kids how to twist the fringes or how to mix colors, my ancestors, they're talking to me, because that reminds me what my dad and my grandpa taught me over the years. But now I'm trying to do it in a different way. I try to make it more fun, especially for my kid. My son, when he was doing his, when I told you a while ago, when he was weaving his first Eye of God, I told him, weaving, it's like playing Legos. It's building. It's all about numbers. So I'm trying to make it more fun, more, to have more interest for them and my daughter too. So thank you.
So, all right. Well, I think that actually brings us up to lunch. So I want to thank you very much, all 3 of you, for sharing your work and answers. Thank you.